On a bitter afternoon, in the final winter after World War II, Washington looked calm on the surface. Victory banners were gone, factories were slowing, and soldiers were boarding trains back to ordinary lives. Yet inside the White House, calm was an illusion. The war that had just ended was already being replaced by another one. Colder, quieter, and potentially far more destructive. The new battlefield was not Europe or the Pacific. It was the sky itself. The upper atmosphere where long-range bombers could travel in straight lines over the curvature of the Earth. It was the depths of oceans where submarines could vanish for months. And it was the Arctic, a region most Americans barely thought about at all. At the center of that frozen expanse sat Greenland. To the public, Greenland was an empty white mass on classroom globes. Ice, snow, and isolation. But to American military planners in 1946, it was the single most important piece of terrain on Earth. Geography had delivered a brutal truth. Any future war between the United States and the Soviet Union would not come from east or west. It would come from above. The shortest path between Moscow and New York ran directly over the North Pole, and Greenland sat squarely in the middle of that route. That made the island more than land. It made it a shield. There was another reason it mattered just as much, hidden not in the air but in the sea. Naval strategists had long understood that Soviet submarines faced a problem. To reach the open Atlantic, they had to pass through narrow corridors of water squeezed between Greenland, Iceland, and the British Isles. These passages were unavoidable. Whoever controlled them controlled access to the Atlantic itself. If those routes were sealed, Soviet submarines would be trapped. American shipping, cities, and coastlines would be protected by distance and detection. Greenland was the anchor of that entire system. This understanding led to a decision so audacious that it still sounds unreal today. The United States would attempt to purchase Greenland outright, not lease it, not negotiate shared control, buy it permanently. An offer was authorized and delivered quietly to Denmark. $100 million, an astronomical sum at the time, and not in unstable paper currency, but in gold. Real gold, drawn from American reserves, enough to rebuild a shattered European capital from the ground up. It was, on paper, one of the most generous land offers in history, and it failed. To understand why American leaders believed such a proposal was even possible, you have to look backward. The United States had done this before. During the First World War, Denmark had been pressured into selling its Caribbean possessions to prevent them from falling into German hands. The transaction had been clean, profitable, and permanent. Flags changed. Sovereignty changed. The world moved on. From Washington's perspective, Greenland was simply the northern version of the same equation. A small European nation holding a distant territory it could not defend. A rising superpower willing to pay for the burden. But history intervened in unexpected ways. During the German occupation of Denmark in 1940, Greenland's fate had already begun drifting away from Copenhagen. With Denmark effectively neutralized, a single Danish diplomat in Washington made a decision that changed everything. Acting on his own authority, he granted the United States permission to defend Greenland and build military installations there. It was an extraordinary move, condemned by the occupied Danish government, and celebrated quietly in Washington. By the time World War II ended, the United States had been operating in Greenland for years. Airfields, weather stations, and radar posts were already in place. American forces had fought secret battles across the ice against German weather teams, whose forecasts could determine naval victories thousands of miles away. To American commanders, Greenland already felt like theirs. Denmark, however, did not see it that way. When peace returned, Denmark reclaimed its voice and its dignity. The country had endured occupation, humiliation, and powerlessness. The idea of selling a massive part of its kingdom, even one far away, carried a symbolic weight that no amount of gold could erase. There was also fear. Denmark sat uncomfortably close to Soviet influence. A public sale of Greenland to the United States would be seen in Moscow not as a real estate transaction, but as an act of alignment. A declaration of sides in a rapidly hardening global standoff. For a small nation with limited defenses, that risk was existential. Behind closed doors, negotiations stretched on. American officials argued that Greenland was an economic drain, that its defense was impossible for Denmark, and that geography itself made American ownership logical. The numbers were tempting. Denmark's infrastructure was in ruins. Fuel was scarce. The future was uncertain. But nations are not balance sheets. Eventually, Denmark said no. The refusal ended the purchase, but it did not end American control. Instead of ownership, the United States secured something almost as powerful, unrestricted military access. Defense agreements signed in the early Cold War granted American forces the right to operate, build, fly, and station personnel across Greenland indefinitely. Denmark kept sovereignty on paper. The United States controlled the strategic reality. That arrangement reshaped the island. Massive air bases were carved into permafrost. Runways long enough for nuclear bombers were built under constant darkness. Greenland became a launch point from which American aircraft could reach the Soviet heartland and return without refueling. The island was no longer remote. It was central. The human cost was quietly ignored. Entire Inuit communities were uprooted to expand military perimeters. Families were given days to leave land they had inhabited for generations. Official narratives framed the relocations as voluntary. Decades later, courts would acknowledge the truth. By then, the damage was permanent. As the Cold War intensified, Greenland's role grew darker. Beneath the ice, secret experiments tested whether entire nuclear missile systems could be hidden inside glaciers. Underground cities were built, powered by reactors, designed to support a mobile arsenal capable of surviving any first strike. The plans violated Danish law and public promises, but secrecy prevailed. Nature ultimately defeated those ambitions. Ice shifted. Tunnels collapsed. Projects were abandoned and buried. Then came disaster. In the late 1960s, a nuclear-armed bomber crashed near a major Greenland base. The weapons did not detonate, but radioactive material spread across the ice. Cleanup crews worked in brutal conditions, exposed to risks they were never fully informed about. The incident exposed years of deception and shattered public trust in Denmark's government. Still, nothing changed strategically. The Cold War ended, but Greenland did not return to obscurity for long. As the planet warmed, the Arctic began to transform. Ice retreated. Shipping lanes opened. Untapped mineral wealth emerged from beneath the melting surface. Rare earth elements, essential for modern technology and weapons, suddenly became accessible. At the same time, a new global rival rose. China, lacking an Arctic coastline but rich in ambition, identified Greenland as a potential gateway. Investments were proposed. Infrastructure projects offered. Airports planned. Each deal carried economic promise and strategic consequence. Washington noticed immediately. What followed was not laughter or indifference, but urgency. Diplomatic pressure increased. Alternative funding appeared. Allies were nudged, sometimes bluntly, to block outside influence. Greenland once again became the focus of great power maneuvering, just as it had been 70 years earlier. When an American president publicly floated the idea of purchasing Greenland in 2019, the world treated it as a joke, but the logic behind it was anything but new. It was the same calculation made generations earlier, updated for a world where resources, data cables, and satellite tracking mattered as much as bombers once did. The difference now is that Greenland has a voice. Self-government has changed the equation. Decisions about mining, development, and alliances are no longer made solely in distant capitals. Greenlanders weigh economic independence against environmental risk, strategic protection against political autonomy. The island is no longer silent. The great irony is that Greenland is now worth far more than anyone imagined in 1946. Its minerals alone dwarf the value of the original offer. Its location is irreplaceable. Its importance grows as the Arctic becomes navigable year-round. The purchase never happened, but the influence did. Control arrived slowly, through treaties, bases, investments, and security guarantees. Inch by inch, rather than all at once. No signature, no gold bars, just time. Greenland remains Danish on maps, autonomous in law, and American in strategy. A place where sovereignty exists in layers and power moves quietly beneath the ice. The most dangerous real estate deal in history was never completed, yet its consequences shape global security to this day. And as ice continues to melt and competition intensifies, the question that haunted Washington in 1946 has not disappeared. It has simply become harder to answer. Who really owns Greenland? And what price would ever be enough? By the time the world entered the third decade of the 21st century, Greenland was no longer just a military asset or a climate curiosity. It had become a bargaining chip in a global contest that looked nothing like the Cold War, yet carried the same sense of inevitability. The ice was retreating faster than even the most pessimistic climate models had predicted, and what it revealed beneath was not just rock, but leverage. For decades, Greenland had survived on subsidies. Denmark's annual block grant paid for hospitals, schools, and public services, quietly anchoring the island to Copenhagen. Independence was a dream, spoken aloud but never fully chased. Because dreams require money, and Greenland's economy had few engines powerful enough to replace Danish support. Fishing helped, tourism was growing, but neither could fund a modern welfare state. That reality made the island vulnerable. As mineral surveys became more precise, Greenland emerged as one of the richest untapped resource zones on Earth. Rare earth elements, essential for smartphones, wind turbines, electric vehicles, and advanced weapon systems, lay beneath its surface. Uranium deposits promised energy and controversy in equal measure. Zinc, iron, and precious stones added to the temptation. In a world racing toward green technology and digital dominance, these were not luxuries, they were necessities. China understood this before most Western governments did. Beijing had spent years consolidating its control over global rare earth supply chains, quietly turning geological luck into political leverage. Greenland represented both a supplement and an insurance policy. If access elsewhere became constrained, the Arctic could provide an alternative. Investments were proposed with careful language: infrastructure development, economic partnership, modernization, airports, ports, mining ventures. Nothing explicitly military, nothing overtly aggressive. But strategy rarely announces itself honestly. In Washington, alarm bells rang. Analysts saw patterns that looked uncomfortably familiar. Infrastructure projects could become logistical hubs. Commercial ports could service naval vessels. Civilian airfields could support military aircraft in a crisis. None of this required conquest or flags. It only required access. The most visible flashpoint came when Chinese-backed firms moved to finance and construct major airports across Greenland. To local politicians, the offers looked transformative. Better connectivity meant tourism, trade, and opportunity. To the Pentagon, they looked like forward operating nodes in the most sensitive region on the planet. Pressure followed swiftly. The United States did not publicly issue ultimatums, but the message reached Copenhagen clearly enough. Allowing a strategic rival to anchor itself in Greenland's transport infrastructure crossed a line. Denmark, usually cautious about interfering in Greenland's internal decisions, stepped in. Using national security authority, it blocked the deals and replaced Chinese financing with Danish funds. The airports would be built, but not by Beijing. To Greenlanders, the episode was a sobering lesson. Independence sounded noble, but autonomy came with constraints. Choosing partners was not purely an economic decision. It was geopolitical, and the margin for error was thin. Every agreement carried invisible consequences, and every rejection risked alienating someone powerful. The United States, meanwhile, adjusted its approach. Instead of blunt offers and dramatic gestures, it leaned into permanence. Diplomatic presence expanded. Investment funds appeared. Military installations were modernized under the language of mutual defense. Radar systems were upgraded, not just to track bombers, but satellites and hypersonic weapons. The Arctic was no longer a frozen buffer. It was becoming an active domain of warfare planning. Beneath the oceans south of Greenland, another vulnerability drew attention. The global economy's nervous system runs through fiber optic cables laid across the seabed. Financial markets, military communications, and everyday internet traffic depend on them. Many of the most critical routes pass through Arctic and North Atlantic waters, close enough to Greenland to be monitored or disrupted. Russian submarines had begun operating near these cables with increasing frequency. They carried no missiles, made no threats, and violated no treaties. They simply lingered, mapping, listening, reminding the West how fragile its digital lifelines truly were. Once again, Greenland found itself overlooking a choke point that mattered far more than anyone outside defense circles realized. History was repeating, not in form, but in function. Greenland had been a shield against bombers, then a barrier against submarines. Now it was a sentinel over data, resources, and emerging Arctic trade routes. The technology had changed. The stakes had not. For the people of Greenland, this resurgence of attention brought both opportunity and unease. Jobs followed, investment, infrastructure improved. But so did surveillance, military traffic, and foreign influence. Memories of forced relocations and secret decisions lingered beneath the surface of modern politics. Every debate about mining, every election, every referendum carried an unspoken question. Development for whom, and at what cost? The island was no longer being discussed as something that could be bought outright. That era had passed, but ownership had evolved. Influence, access, dependency, and alignment mattered more than legal deeds. Power had learned to move quietly. As the Arctic opened and competition intensified, Greenland was no longer a peripheral territory waiting to be discovered. It was a crossroads. And like all crossroads in history, it attracted forces far larger than the people who lived there. The final chapter of this story is not about offers made or rejected, but about choices still unfolding, and those choices will determine whether Greenland becomes a nation fully in control of its destiny, or a permanent front line in someone else's global strategy. In the end, Greenland is not dangerous because of what it is, but because of where it sits in the human imagination. It is a place where maps stop being abstract and start shaping history. A place where distance no longer protects, and emptiness turns into opportunity. The ice gives the illusion of silence, but beneath it, forces are moving faster than ever. What makes Greenland uniquely volatile is that every major power sees something different when they look at it. The United States sees a shield that must never fall into hostile hands, a forward line of defense against threats that travel at the speed of sound and light. China sees a gateway, a logistics node for a future Arctic economy, a source of minerals critical to technological dominance. Russia sees proximity, vulnerability, and a reminder that the shortest path between rivals still runs across the top of the world. Denmark sees history, responsibility, and the slow erosion of a relationship built for a different century. And the people of Greenland see all of it at once. They see opportunity wrapped in risk, independence tied to extraction, prosperity linked to forces they do not control. Every proposal promises jobs and growth, but also dependency. Every rejection preserves autonomy, but delays freedom. There is no clean path forward, only trade-offs. This is why the idea of buying Greenland never truly disappeared. Not because modern leaders believe countries can still be purchased like land parcels, but because the instinct behind the offer never went away. The belief that security can be secured through control, that geography can be solved with ownership, that influence is safer when formalized. But Greenland resists simple solutions. It cannot be absorbed without consequences. It cannot be ignored without risk. And it cannot remain neutral forever, as the Arctic transforms from a frozen barrier into a navigable arena. Climate change has not just altered temperatures, it has rewritten strategy. What was once inaccessible is now exposed. What was once peripheral is now central. The irony is that the most powerful forces shaping Greenland's future are not armies or politicians, but physics. Melting ice redraws shipping lanes. Retreating glaciers reveal resources. Changing oceans alter military planning. Human ambition follows behind, adapting, competing, pressing forward. This makes Greenland the most dangerous real estate deal in history, not because of a failed transaction in the past, but because no deal can ever truly settle its fate. Any attempt to lock it into one camp, one alliance, one vision of the future, invites resistance from another. Power accumulates there, whether invited or not. If history teaches anything, it is that Greenland never needed to be owned, to be controlled, and never needed to be occupied, to be contested. Influence arrived through runways, radar stations, treaties, investments, and quiet pressure. It arrived without signatures and without ceremonies. Slowly, methodically, almost invisibly. And that process is still unfolding. The question is no longer whether Greenland will matter. That debate ended decades ago. The real question is whether the people who live there will be allowed to decide how it matters, or whether their island will continue to serve as a strategic answer to someone else's fears. One day, historians may look back and realize that the most consequential moment was not when an offer was made, but when the world began to understand that some places are too important to ever truly belong to anyone. Greenland is one of them. The ice will keep melting. The ships will keep coming. The cables will keep humming beneath the sea. And the map that once obsessed a president in the aftermath of a world war will remain pinned to the walls of power, unchanged in its meaning, even as everything else changes around it. Because whoever shapes Greenland's future does not just influence the Arctic. They influence the balance of the world. And that is why this story is far from over. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video and want to stay updated with more insights on finance, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Financial Coin. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss our latest videos.